Frieren is better than your favorite shonen anime. And I know why. Frieren as an anime understands a thing that a shockingly few amount of anime ever get close to grasping. See, because while every long-running anime out there prides itself on its world building, not until Frieren came around did it truly feel like viewers understood what it felt like to step into a world that was truly alive. A world that felt alive not just because we were told it felt alive, not just because the backgrounds are painted vibrant colors, but because the history of the Frieren world has consequences. That's the difference that separates Frieren from the pack. What do I mean by this? Plenty of anime and manga have history, and history always has consequences. History is how we got here in the first place. But there's telling and there's showing, and your favorite shonen anime is telling you while Frieren shows you. Don't believe me? Well, soon you will, because today we're talking Frieren is better than your favorite shonen anime. But before we get to praising a show that we really haven't talked about all that much on this channel, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. Sasuke and Gaara's wrapped up, and it's time for the Konoha Crush arc. Let's be honest with ourselves here real quick. All anime have backstories. Whether that backstory come in the packaging of mythology, ancient kings, dead heroes, ruined civilizations, old demons, legendary spells, all of that. Sometimes it feels as though that mythos that these anime worlds are built off is just that. Mythos. In these stories, history becomes decorative. It's there to serve one purpose and one purpose alone, to make the setting of this world feel larger. Take, for example, the show I talk about more than anything, Naruto. Sure, if you talk about the entirety of Naruto's timeline, it spans over 1,000 years in length, but there's really no need for Naruto's timeline to be 1,000 years long. There's no real weight injected to the idea that Kaguya came 1,000 plus years ago. There's no real weight that there's been dozens, if not hundreds of cycles of reincarnations. The injection of Kaguya and the introduction of the reincarnations of Ashura and Indra are simply used as tools to inject the idea that this battle between Sasuke and Naruto has always been fated. It doesn't add to the story in really any identifiably positive way, but it's history. It's there to make you think, wow, the Naruto worlds existed for longer than I thought. But Frieren is different, because in Frieren, history comes with pressure. History changes how people think. It changes how power is discussed. It changes how institutions function. And more than anything, it changes how emotion lands. Because the core idea of Frieren is not just, oh, Frieren is an elf who lives for a long time. Isn't that silly? The core idea to Frieren is that her relationship to time has eroded her ability to properly understand the value of human interaction. And thus it's not until those humans are gone that Frieren realizes that the moments she had with them are fleeting. That is what this story is actually about. And because that's what the story's about, and it centers around an immortal main character, every interaction that Frieren goes through can have delayed meaning. There doesn't have to be an immediate feedback for the things that are happening in Frieren's story, because any event that's happening in the present can tie its meaning back to the past. And that's why the setting feels so alive. But to display to you specifically how this is incorporated into Frieren's story, the easiest place to start is examining Frieren's story structure in itself. Because even from the perspective of something as bare bones as its story structure, Frieren is incredibly unique. Because Frieren as a story starts where most fantasy stories would end. The Demon King has already been defeated. The grand decade-long adventure with Heiter, Himmel, and Aizen has come to its conclusion. Himmel, the hero of the land, is already dead. Heiter and Aizen are old and out of their primes. The journey we would usually spend our time watching has already completed. And thus in the first episode, Frieren is establishing to you that the story is not one that only assigns value to heroes who are able to defeat the bad guys. It's a story solely focused on the idea of watching history become memory. It's a story about how after even people are gone, they leave pieces of themselves with those who live on. It's a story about learning to appreciate the moments in history that you exist in them while you exist in them. And this is why some people might call Frieren boring or repetitive, because the premise of Frieren allows for it to get mileage out of things that would be minute details in other animes. A statue matters. The pose that Himmel was doing in said statue matters. A village matters. A grave matters. A field of flowers matters. Because Frieren's world, unlike so many shonen anime that try to inject this idea of history into our brains, is not built It's emotionally accumulated. See, in fantasy anime or in shonen anime, when a character visits an old location, like the village they came from, the main function of that scene is usually to invoke sadness in you or nostalgia. However, consider the fact that Frieren as a story is basically Frieren retracing her steps to the Northern Plateau. Every time we see Frieren interacting with something or somebody that she interacted with back when she was in the hero's party, it recontextualizes the first journey. Frieren sees live what the aftermath of the hero's party coming through 50 or so years ago did for the areas that she's in now. Take, for example, one of the final episodes of season 2 of Frieren, where Frieren, Stark, and Fern are trying to cross something akin to a continental divide and are talking to the dwarf who spent 200 years building the bridge that bridges said divide. We learn after the interaction that Frieren has with this dwarf and the memories that flood back into her as she has this conversation that the only reason that this bridge was ever completed is because Himmel gave the dwarf the money to build the bridge. Money that, mind you, the hero's party had gotten by returning the magical sword that had been lost by the high noble family that ran the company that delivered all the goods in the Northern Plateau. And thus, even within the confines of a memory from 50 years ago, that secondary timeline, the timeline of the past, the timeline of the hero's party, as we flow forward, has consequences. Oh, we were able to find this sword and return it to its rightful owners. The money we got from that job could pay for a bridge. And because that bridge has been built, the dwarf who built this bridge out of regret for not being able to allow soldiers to save his village has rebuilt his village. Since Frieren is a story built on 2 semi-parallel timelines, we in live time see the consequences of Frieren and the hero party's decisions. And that oftentimes draws us back to Himmel as a character. Because even though Himmel dies in the first episode of Frieren, he feels as though he's everywhere. See, a lot of characters with dead heroes tend to abuse their memory. They're either worshipped, underexplained, and overhyped, or they're used as generic motivation. Take, for example, Shisui, a character who has basically no plot relevance in Naruto whatsoever, but because of how he's overhyped and underexplained, and his connection to an important character in Itachi, he becomes a godlike figure not only in the story, but also amongst the fan base, even though his only plot relevance comes from the eyes that he left behind. But Frieren's relationship with Himmel is different, because Himmel's presence in Frieren's story isn't just because the story wants to insist that he was important, wants to beat it into your head that he was the hero of the realm. No, Himmel's important to Frieren as a character and as a story, because Frieren is constantly reminded as she retraces her steps to the Northern Plateau of ways that Himmel was deeply important over the course of their journey that she didn't fully appreciate the first time around. This is why Himmel as a character works so well. He's not treated as this deity, at least from the perspective of the story. He's treated as a vehicle to help Frieren along in her journey of humanization. By reflecting on all of the good that he did, Frieren finds value in her other human relationships. And it's not just Frieren who invokes his memory. And that might truly be what separates Frieren from your standard anime's approach at history. Because sure, Sasuke remembers Itachi, and sure, Naruto remembers Jiraiya. Yuji remembers Nanami. Levi remembers Erwin. But Frieren takes this a step further. Not only do individual people remember those from history, the world itself inside of Frieren remembers people. But it's not just Himmel and his statues and his good deeds that are a reminder of the events past. The actual main characters of Frieren live as a stark reminder that history has brought us to this point. For example, Fern and Stark, because these two display that the history of Frieren is not static. It's active. Fern is not just Frieren's apprentice. She's a part of a chain of history that runs through Heiter, through Frieren, and into the future. Heiter handing off Fern to Frieren is not just a touching character moment. It's one of the foundational acts of the story because it forces Frieren into this mother-like role that requires emotional intimacy that she doesn't have until substantially down the line. Heiter lives on through Fern. He guides Frieren on this path of her humanization through his connection to her. And Stark works the exact same way, but with Aizen. Stark is not just the warrior in the new party or the new frontliner. He's somebody carrying forth Aizen's values, his strength, his combat techniques, but in a way that feels separate from Aizen's because he's not a dwarf like Aizen. He doesn't have his stoic nature. He doesn't have his long life. He continues on Aizen's story in an imperfect, human kind of way. And this is another one of those places where Frieren separates itself. Characters don't replace each other. They continue each other. Take, for example, Sabo basically popping up the second that Ace dies. Sure, we know that Ace and Sabo and Luffy were all raised as brothers. And sure, Sabo takes the flame fruit and essentially becomes Ace the second that Ace gets donut hole. But Sabo doesn't carry on Ace's legacy. And for that matter, neither does Luffy, really. Ironically, the person who holds on to Ace's legacy more than anybody else is Yamato. Saying that they carry on Ace's legacy is even kind of a stretch. And thus, while we know all of these people connected to Ace, we don't feel the history of the life that Ace lived affecting the modern day. But in Frieren, we do. And in no place is that more felt than Frieren's power system. See, plenty of power systems get origin stories. Chakra in the Naruto universe came from when Hagoromo tried to spread Ninshu, which was mental energy across the entire world, but humanity combined it with their physical energy to create chakra, which they molded into ninjutsu and genjutsu and taijutsu. Cursed energy in the JJK universe comes from negative emotions, specifically from people in Japan. And in Soul Eater, Soul Resonance came from Shinra Bancho Man when he created the Soul Eater universe. However, unfortunately for a lot of these power systems, they feel as though their backstories were tooled specifically to fit into an already existing universe. But the same can't be said for Frieren. Frieren's power system feels cultural. Frieren's power system doesn't feel like, oh, we need this magical ability, and this magical ability, and maybe in 200 chapters, we'll explain how somebody thought that up. No, in Frieren, magic feels like the entire world was built around it. It has standards and hierarchies. It's gotten better depending on who's gotten their hands on it. Some magic is viewed as redundant. Some is seen as old and now outclassed by modern day magical means. And this is why the mage material aspect of Frieren works so well. Even though it's not a universe that cares about power scaling or even action to a large extent, its power system feels more central to the story than a lot of action anime. And that's why when Frieren wants to be an action anime, like in its first class mage exam arc, it doesn't feel weird or out of place. In fact, it leads to some of the best content Frieren's ever made. Because while lesser tournament or exam arcs are just excuses for mangakas to make up new techniques and show exactly how powerful everybody is with little to no explanation, Frieren's first class mage exam shows us not only all of the pretty fights that we could ever want, but also perfectly displays how different people from different walks of life understand magic differently. Some see magic as a means for survival, some see magic as art, and some see magic as discipline. Ubel's magic allows her to cut down anything she implicitly understands. Denkin, who was an intellectual businessman before he ever considered being a mage, has cold and calculating magic specifically calibrated to his scheming style. And thus magic in the Frieren universe doesn't feel like, oh, well, I want them to be like this and therefore they should have this kind of magic. And rather it feels like the inverse, that, oh, because this character was like this is the kind of magic they learn. And since we're talking about Denkin, the arc that best demonstrates all of these things that I'm talking about is an arc that mostly revolves around him, the Golden Land arc, the next arc that's going to be adapted by the anime. Roughly chapters 77 to 104. See, because while people could say, oh, Frieren feels too episodic, there's no big arcs, it feels like we're doing the same adventure every single episode, it really is the Golden Land arc where all of these incredible pieces feel like they come together, where time, memory, legacy, magical culture, and emotional aftermath all come together thematically to make what I believe is the best arc of Frieren. An arc that centers around, like Frieren, a character from the past, Mocked, the last remaining demon general, and one of the most memorable antagonists of this entire manga. And what makes him memorable is that his sheer existence forces the world's history and philosophy to collide. See, because Mock could have just been another overpowered ancient demon from a bygone era with abilities that died with time, but he remembers. And yeah, his ability is objectively kind of silly. He can transmute literally anything into gold on a scale kind of unseen by anybody in the Frieren universe up until we meet Mocked. I mean, it's not like he can just turn one person into gold, he can turn entire landscapes into gold. And while that sounds like a great money-making scheme, it's also not what you want your Tuesday to look like. But Mocked is so much more than just strong, because his strength represents something. Demons in Frieren are inherently interesting characters because they can look and sound humanoid. They can even feel as though they're empathizing with somebody. But there's this gap that exists between what they're saying and what they actually mean. And Mock, to me, is the most interesting version of this display. See, yes, he's strong, and therefore a part of his story is the heroes of the story trying to defeat him. But his strength also comes as a way to separate him from others in demon kind, to turn him into the golden example of what a demon should be. When Mock finds himself pondering as to whether or not he's actually afraid of death, he treats himself with disgust, because fear surrounding a concept like death is an inherently human emotion. And yet, as Mock is the strongest demon we've been introduced to up until this point, he has this golden example as for some reason feeling something that he believes is intrinsically tied to humans and humans alone. And thus Frieren as a story isn't just asking, oh, can these heroes beat the biggest bad? It's asking whether or not proximity to moral concepts can create understanding. It's not just good villain writing, it's world building through psychology. We intrinsically understand that Mocked, as the last standing bastion of a bygone era of demons, has lived so tangentially to humanity and has tried so hard to mimic humanity, to trick them into falling into their traps, that his proximity to these moral concepts he's been mimicking in order to kill humans have in some odd way rubbed off on him. And thus in this moment we feel the weight of the history that Mocked has lived through. And while, like I said earlier, this history can be felt from truly any single character in Frieren, it's truly the oldest amongst the Frieren cast that carried the most historical weight with them. The best example outside of Frieren and Mocked being Serie. See, Serie is not just some overpowered elf sitting atop the magical government. She's somebody from an older and harsher magical world, displayed in not only the way she treats those around her, but also in the way that she dresses herself. See, Frieren is ancient too, but Frieren's been changed by traveling with humans. She's been softened, not in the sense that she's weaker than Serie, but softened in the sense that human interaction has changed how she interacts with the world. Frieren, like Serie, was an isolationist prior to meeting Himmel. She dressed in the clothing of the time that she was brought into the world. Humans and the trends that they brought were seen as fleeting things that passed with time. But for Frieren, the introduction of Himmel changed her. But Serie lives as a living memory of history that never bent. And these two characters that could be identical, being stark opposites from each other, creates historical context, because their simultaneous existence shows us two living magical eras coexisting. And that is what a living world does. They contain ideological holdovers from previous generations. And the passing down of that culture is what Frieren is about. I mean, think about what Frieren has taught Fern. Basic offensive and defensive magic. The fundamentals of magic that existed at its very inception, making Fern, by modern day standards, an incredibly old-fashioned mage. But the reason that Fern is an old-fashioned mage is because Frieren comes from an old-fashioned time. Fern stands as a representation in the modern era beyond Frieren of the history of magic. And therefore, if anybody asks you, well, what makes Frieren so special? The answer can be simple. Choices have consequences. Decisions have long-lasting effects. See, because while a lot of fantasy anime are great at build up and maybe even great at payoff, so few of them are great at aftermath. But Frieren understands that the true meaning of an event is often laid barest after its conclusion, after people have to continue living with what was changed. That's as true of battles as it is of relationships, as it is of cities. And that's why small things hit so much harder in Frieren, because nothing is ever just a thing. Everything belongs to a chain of meaning. It's not because the world's bigger than everybody else's. It's not because there's more factions. It's not because we spend more time talking about the history. It's not because there's more lore or more politicking. It's because the world has continuity of meaning. People leave parts of themselves behind. Other people inherit them. Places store the memories of events and people, and time changes what those events and people mean. It's what life feels like. It's what history feels like. Look, for example, at something like the Second Amendment in the American Constitution, the right to bear arms. An amendment that's been brought up time and time again to justify the 35 ARs they have in case they happen to bump into a feral hog. An amendment that's been thrown time and time again in the face of grieving parents crying over the loss of their student who died in a violent shooting. An amendment that felt evil until America was truly, for the first time in its history, presented with a truly tyrannical government. And thus now a lot of the people who have been trying to get rid of the Second Amendment for years understand the utility of the Second Amendment when faced with true evil. Historical context changes with time, and therefore Frieren's greatest superpower as a story is that it centers around an immortal being who couldn't see history's context unfolding before her. So the world of Frieren is not just the story setting, it's the mechanism through which Frieren learns how to value life. This is why Himmel matters, why Fern matters, why Stark matters, why the statues matter, why every flower matters. Because every single one of these things is living proof that history never leaves the room. And that's why I believe when people say that for some reason Frieren feels special, I don't think it's because the series is emotional or beautiful or occasionally has ridiculously well animated fights. I think Frieren feels special because it understands something that no other anime has truly ever grasped. Because Frieren understands that a world isn't alive just because it has history. A world only lives when that history still affects the present. And that is what makes Frieren so special. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. What is it that makes Frieren feel so special? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, my fiance is home from work 7 hours earlier than usual, so I'm gonna go spend time with her.